What would you do if the person you trusted the most betrayed you? For years, I thought my marriage was solid, built on love, loyalty, and all the things you think make a relationship unshakable. But one day, everything changed. It started with whispers in the background, suspicious behavior, and a confession that shattered my world. This is the story of how I uncovered the truth, faced the heartbreak head-on, and found the strength to rebuild my life. If you've ever felt betrayed or questioned the foundation of a relationship, stay with me. My story isn't just about pain, it's about learning to let go and finding yourself again. There's nothing quite like that rush. Getting promoted at work felt like a dream. I'd worked tirelessly for years, pouring every ounce of energy into climbing the ladder. And now, it had paid off. My boss handed me the news that morning, and all I could think about was sharing it with Samantha, my wife. She'd been my biggest cheerleader, or so I thought. The drive home was electric. My mind buzzed with plans for how we'd celebrate. Maybe dinner at her favorite spot, or a weekend getaway. Things were finally aligning, but the moment I stepped inside, that excitement dimmed. Something was off. The house wasn't how I'd left it, eerily quiet. Even the scent of her usual lavender candle was missing. I called out for Samantha, expecting her to come rushing, but no answer. I walked further in, and that's when I heard it. A low murmur, coming from the living room. At first, I froze, unsure if I should interrupt. I wasn't sure why, but my gut churned. As I crept closer, the muffled voice became clearer. It wasn't hers. It was a man's voice. My chest tightened and my heart raced. Samantha's laugh pierced the quiet, followed by quick shuffling sounds. Something wasn't right. I hesitated before stepping into the room, unsure if I was ready to see what was on the other side of the door. I stepped into the living room slowly, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Samantha sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees. The room felt too staged, like she had just positioned herself there seconds ago. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as though she had been mid-typing, but her startled expression gave her away. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood silently in the doorway watching. The faint sound of a man's voice lingered in the air, and though I couldn't make out the words, the tone didn't feel casual. When she looked up, her smile came too late, too forced. "Hey! You're home early," she said, closing the laptop, a little too quickly. The sound of the lid shutting echoed in the quiet room, and I couldn't help but notice how her body tensed. My gut screamed at me, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining things. Still, something in her tone felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced it for this exact moment. My eyes darted to the screen, but it was already dark. I asked who she'd been talking to, trying to keep my voice steady, but my question seemed to catch her off guard. "Oh, just an old friend," she replied, her words laced with a strange mix of nonchalance and defensiveness. Her gaze darted away as she fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. That little detail didn't escape me. Samantha always fidgeted when she was uncomfortable. I wanted to believe her, but the lump forming in my throat told me this wasn't just some innocent conversation. Something was slipping through my fingers, and I wasn't sure I could catch it in time. I couldn't let it slide, not this time. I took a step closer, locking eyes with her as calmly as I could manage. "An old friend?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched, but quickly masked it with a tight-lipped smile. "Yeah, just someone from college," she said, brushing it off like it was nothing. But the crack in her composure was there, glaring and impossible to ignore. I pressed on, asking why their voice was still audible when I walked in. Her response came too quickly, like she'd rehearsed it. We were just catching up, nothing big. Her defensiveness only fueled my doubts. She leaned back, crossing her arms, a wall between us. "Why are you being so weird about this?" she asked, feigning annoyance. But her tone betrayed her. It wasn't anger, it was panic, carefully. disguised. I could feel the distance between us growing, an invisible chasm that seemed impossible to cross. I told myself to stay calm, to not jump to conclusions, but the weight in my chest kept growing. I tried to explain how it looked from my perspective, how it felt, walking into a scene that didn't add up. Her laugh was bitter, dismissive. "You're overthinking things as usual," she said, her words cutting deeper than I expected. But it wasn't enough to quiet the noise in my head. Her refusal to meet my eyes and the tension in her body spoke louder than any excuse she could give. Something was unraveling between us, and I had no idea how to stop it, or if I even should. Her words came out of nowhere, like a dagger I didn't see coming. "You know, sometimes I miss feeling alive," she said, her voice trembling just enough to make it sound real. I froze, unsure how to even respond. Feeling alive? What was she trying to say? My mind raced to fill in the gaps, but before I could speak, she let out a sigh, as though unburdening herself. "I mean, things between us, they felt so predictable, so comfortable." She used that word as if it were a curse. Comfortable. It made my stomach churn. I stared at her, searching her face for something. Regret, guilt, a shred of affection, but all I saw was frustration. "It's like we've lost something," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore, but I know I don't feel it." Her honesty was brutal, like ripping a bandage off an unhealed wound. I wanted to shout, to tell her how hard I'd been working for us, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt like it was closing up. She must have seen the hurt in my eyes because her tone softened. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, leaning forward like she wanted to close the distance, but it was too late for that. The gap between us felt insurmountable. Her confession wasn't just a crack in our foundation. It was an earthquake, shaking everything I thought I knew about us. My chest tightened as I tried to process her words, but deep down I already knew. Things would never be the same again. I didn't pack my bags right away. Instead, I sat in our bedroom, staring at the walls we'd painted together, the pictures we'd hung as if they meant something permanent. I wanted to believe her words weren't as final as they sounded, but the weight of her confession lingered like a storm cloud I couldn't escape. My hands shook as I opened the closet, pulling out the suitcase I hadn't touched since our last vacation, our last real moment of happiness. As I folded my clothes, I realized how heavy silence could be. She didn't come after me, didn't try to stop me. That, more than anything, broke me. When she finally appeared in the doorway, her eyes were glassy, but her posture was firm. "You don't have to do this," she said, almost pleading but not quite. Her voice lacked the desperation I'd hoped for, the kind that would make me believe she cared enough to fight. I looked at her, searching for the woman I thought I knew, but she felt like a stranger. "How can I stay when I can't trust you?" I said quietly, my voice cracking under the weight of my own words. She didn't respond, just stood there, biting her lip, as if debating whether to say more. As I zipped the suitcase, I felt the finality of it. Every inch of the house seemed to cling to me, like it knew I wouldn't be back. She followed me to the door, her steps hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she wanted me to leave or if she was just too proud to ask me to stay. When I crossed the threshold, suitcase in hand, I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I had, I might have broken completely. The first night away from home was the hardest. I checked into a motel, the kind with paper-thin walls and buzzing neon signs, not because I didn't have other options, but because it matched how I felt. Cheap, temporary, disposable. I stared at the peeling wallpaper, running the days, events over and over in my head. My thoughts weren't just about her words, but about all the little moments I'd ignored, the late nights she brushed off, the sudden need for privacy. Every detail now seemed like a puzzle piece I hadn't cared to fit together. Days turned into weeks, and I avoided her calls. She texted a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to read beyond the preview. "Can we talk?" she had written, as if a single conversation could undo the damage. It wasn't just what she said that day, it was the look in her eyes. She was sorry, sure, but not for the right reasons. She was sorry I found out, not sorry for what she did. I realized I needed to stop waiting for answers that would never satisfy me. Eventually, I made the decision that felt inevitable. I filed for divorce. The weight of those papers in my hands was heavier than I'd imagined, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. I knew she'd fight it, not because she wanted me back, but because the reality of her choices had finally set in. I wasn't angry anymore, not like I had been. I was something worse, indifferent. It was the kind of quiet resolve that comes when you've accepted the truth, even if it leaves you hollow. The courtroom felt cold, detached, as if it existed to strip away the last shreds of anything personal. I sat there, trying not to look at her, but my eyes betrayed me. Samantha looked different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of what she'd done had finally caught up to her. She clutched a tissue in her hand, twisting it like it held the answers she couldn't find. When the judge asked if we'd considered reconciliation, she looked at me, her eyes pleading for something I couldn't give her anymore. My response was simple but firm. "No, Your Honor." Her turn came, and she tried to explain herself, her voice shaking with emotion. "I made mistakes," she said, her words laced with regret. "But I've learned, and I just want the chance to make things right." It was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen her, but it felt too late. Her apology wasn't for me. It was for herself, a way to absolve her guilt. I stared at the table in front of me, waiting for it to end. The memories of her laughter with someone else echoed in my mind, drowning out her words. When the proceedings concluded, the judge declared the divorce finalized. It should have felt like closure, but instead it felt like ripping off the last bandage and realizing the wound underneath hadn't healed. As we left the courtroom, she called out to me, one last attempt to bridge the gap. "Please, just think about it," she said softly. I didn't respond. What was there to think about? Trust wasn't something you could rebuild with words. And I was done chasing ghosts. Months after the divorce, I thought the storm had passed. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm, not perfect, but manageable. Then one evening, her name popped up in my inbox. I hesitated before clicking it, my chest tightening at the sight of her familiar words. The subject line read, "I owe you the truth." I braced myself, unsure if I even wanted to read what she had to say. Curiosity won. Her email was long, filled with an almost frantic need to explain what I already knew, but had never heard from her own lips. She admitted it, everything. The late-night conversations, the flirtation, the thrill she claimed she hadn't felt in years. She painted it as harmless at first, just someone who made her feel seen in a way she thought I couldn't anymore. But then came her realization. Buried halfway through the email, it wasn't harmless, not to her, and certainly not to me. "I didn't mean for it to go as far as it did," she wrote, but she didn't elaborate. That deliberate vagueness left more questions than answers. And honestly, I didn't care to fill in the blanks anymore. She ended with an apology that felt raw and rehearsed all at once. "You deserved better, and I hope one day you find someone who gives you that," she wrote. It wasn't the closure she probably thought she was offering. If anything, it stirred up old wounds I'd worked hard to heal. But there was something liberating about seeing her take responsibility, even if it came too late. For the first time, I felt the faintest flicker of gratitude, not for her, but for the clarity her confession gave me. I sat with her email open for hours, rereading it, until the words blurred together. I wasn't angry anymore. The sharp edges of betrayal had dulled over time, but I wasn't moved either. Her confession, while honest, didn't change anything for me. I thought about ignoring it, letting her words fade into the void. But something told me to respond, not for her, But for me, I needed her to understand that while I appreciated her honesty, it wouldn't erase what had been broken. When I finally replied, I kept it short. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I wrote, my fingers pausing over the keyboard. "It takes courage to admit mistakes, and I hope it brings you peace. But I've moved on, and I think it's best that the past stays where it is." I could feel the finality in my words, like shutting a door that had been left open for far too long. There was no malice, no lingering bitterness, just a quiet certainty that I didn't need closure from her. I'd already found it on my own. Hitting send felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I wasn't looking for a reply, and I doubted she'd send one. My life had taken a new shape, one that didn't include her, and I was okay with that. Her email wasn't a chance for reconciliation. It was the last page of a chapter I'd already finished, and with that, I closed my laptop, feeling lighter than I had in months. Months turned into a year, and life gradually began to rebuild itself around me. At first, I carried the weight of what had happened like a stone in my chest, but over time, it started to shrink. I realized that the betrayal, as painful as it had been, didn't define me. It was just one thread in a much larger tapestry. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that had formed long before that day in the living room, cracks neither of us had bothered to fix. Maybe that's where it all began to unravel. Samantha's confession, her regret, it didn't haunt me the way it used to. I stopped wondering if I could have done more or if she could have. We were two people who'd outgrown each other in the worst way possible. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the slow erosion of trust, the unspoken resentments, and the distance we let grow between us. The lesson, though painful, was clear. Love without trust is like a house without a foundation. It's only a matter of time before it collapses. Now, I find peace in the small things. Quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, conversations with people who bring light into my life, the freedom to shape my future without compromise. I don't hate Samantha. If anything, I hope she's found the answers she was looking for. But as for me, I've learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, not just of someone else, but of the version of yourself that stayed too long.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.